Please, Ajay.
Ram, it's a pleasure to see you again after so many years, and it's actually a delight to listen to you. It's even more fun than what you used to be in college. But look, I think of this whole topic, I just have one thought, which is that the scale of violence has changed enormously from the time that Gandhi got his thinking clear. In fact, his violence is violence. But the scale of violence and the impact of that violence to the effect that Master Guha was just saying is very different. How do you think that changes the way that we think about things today in this light, in this context? It doesn't that play to some extent the question asked here and that we just discussed, and scale and nature of violence?
There are two aspects to it, which is an intranational and an international. I mean, the scale of violence is increasing intranationally too. And the weaponry available to rebellious groups. For example, in India, there is a left-wing Maoist rebellion in Central India. Now, in the old days, they would have had a single-shot rifle. Now they have AK-47s. But it makes it more dangerous. And I think the crucial thing is that, at least within a country, when you use violence, social change becomes less sustainable. In a country like India, for example, if the Maoist revolutionaries want to enter the democratic process, to follow what has happened in Nepal, and to try and persuade to get concerns about rights for tribals and disadvantaged people. Whereas if they escalate violence, then the Indian army will come in and so on. So I think actually it's made the fact that the means of violence available today are far more sophisticated, wide-ranging, and destructive, makes non-violence even more important. And it's clear that in Egypt, for example, or in Tunisia, guns would not have. Libya is a slightly different and special case. And it's clear that, or to give an example, many of us have forgotten, but historians like me have not forgotten, which is Central Europe between 1989 and 1991. I mean, the Polish army could not have been defeated by guns. I mean, likewise, the East German regime or the Bulgarian regime, it could only have been defeated by non-violent resistance. So I think, actually, the proliferation of means of violence, the fact that the armaments now are so much more sophisticated and deadly, makes at least within a country, it makes it more, even tactically, forget morally. Morally, non-violence always has a strong case. But even tactically, I think non-violence is far more likely to affect sustainable political resolutions.
Yes, the lady, please.
Hi, my name is Spandana. I'm an intern at the PMI. I don't know if my question is going to be politically sensitive or not, but it's your prerogative to answer. Just a few, 2-3 weeks back, we saw few examples of the methods used by Mahatma Gandhi in the Ramlila Maidan.
That's it.
Right. So I'm actually referring to Mr. Anna Hazare.
Yeah.
And I want to just hear your take on his non-violent methods and his take on Gandhi's methods. I just want to know what your perspective. Do you think those were, is that relevant in these times of time?
Yeah, I think the reference was to a recent protest in Delhi about 6 weeks ago, a non-violent protest where a social worker went on fast against corruption in public administration. Now that was one. Again, I didn't use it. Next to my talk actually it's mentioned. Have a look. But it's very interesting that even in India, India is a democracy, a vigorous functioning democracy, but a flawed democracy. And it's a democracy, in my book India After Gandhi, I call it a 50-50 democracy. There is no 100-0 democracy, that's utopia, or maybe North Korea. You can only have a 65-70% democracy. I mean, human beings are flawed, so the political system they create will also be flawed. So I would like India to be, maybe some countries in the world, possibly Norway could be an example, which is 60-65% democracy and so on. So we are a flawed democracy. And there are fault lines that need to be corrected. The public institutions that need to be reformed. How do you do it? One method is the method of the Maoist revolutionaries, the gun. Another method is that of the religious fundamentalists, in different parts of India, which is Islamic and Hindu, which is also the gun. Alright. Now, however, non-violent movements can affect social change. And there are examples through the history of independent India. The first example was in 1952, which you won't believe it, but was before even I was born. But still, as a historian, I've studied it. When a determined eccentric follower of Gandhi called Potti Sriramulu went on a fast unto death in a town called Madras in South India for a state of Telugu speakers. He died, and as a result of his fast, India was recreated as linguistic states. And that's why we survived, because we haven't imposed a single language, Hindi or English, on all of India. Our multilingualism is India's greatest strength. Unlike countries in the region which have had civil wars, because one language has been imposed upon the minority. And that was the Gandhian protest. Move to the 70s, the environmental movement, the Chipko movement, the celebrated movement against deforestation, which put a halt to deforestation in the Himalaya by commercial interests, was non-violent. Now, if they picked up the gun, this would not have happened. So I think the movement, the Ramlila Maidan you mentioned too, the anti-corruption movement, was in that tradition. I'm not saying it's not flawless. Of course, there are aspects. I think that the television cameras that Ambassador Puri mentioned are very seductive, but can also be very dangerous. Gandhi observed one weekly day of silence. And I think many of our social activists and our political leaders would do well to observe one weekly day. When they speak only to themselves, not to the television camera, demagoguery in the television. So I think the gentleman who was a fine social worker who was leading this anti-corruption campaign got swayed by the television and the media cameras and so on. So he made some reckless remarks which he did have to recant, which Gandhi would not have, because firstly Gandhi spoke very softly into a camera. Gandhi would have been a disaster in the television days if he would have done this. And of course he kept a weekly day of silence. But I think the important thing about Gandhi is this: restraint, reflection, introspection, willingness to take criticism, and willingness to wait out the long term, not wanting instant gratification, instant results. I mean, one of his favorite lines, which is taken from actually a 19th century British Catholic theologian, was, "One step at a time is enough for me." One step. And I think that's a very important lesson for all of us. So I think, in my view, there is a place for non-violent civil disobedience, even in a democracy like the United States, which is a great democracy, but was also a flawed democracy, and it took the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King to tell them what their flaws were and how to correct them.
Yes, please.
Hi, Dr. Guha, Thomas Sept from the UN Alliance of Civilizations. First of all, I deeply regret we were unable to bring you to Rio last year for the forum. I was trying very hard. Great talk. On this point of violence, I just want to make the point that, if you look at the list of conflicts in the world produced, for instance, by the Heidelberg Institute of Conflict Research, the message of Gandhi is really relevant, because that list points out that most of the conflicts in the world today are internal. And about 2/3 of these conflicts are because of some kind of cultural dimensions like ethnicity, religion, language, or a combination thereof. This issue about the environment is where I want to pose a question to you. This whole issue has been coming up, from time to time again. President Clinton, when he was in China in '92, mentioned that the biggest threat to the world security was not if China was to build up arms, but if a billion Chinese started to consume like a billion Americans. But really, what is the alternative? Because you see every country, and China and India, and every other emerging countries, hungry for resources, trying to satisfy the middle class. What is the alternative? Can we all go to a Gandhi economy?